Okay, students, so here we go. This is our first lecture. How shall we call it? The pandemic version of environmental health. We started off on this topic on allergies and allergens. So these first few slides I'm going to zip through pretty quickly since we already talked about them in class. I started talking about how the immune system that deals with parasitic worms seems to be the same part of the immune system as the part that deals with allergies. So here's a few parasites that I'm hoping that you've never had, with the exception of pinworm, which I mentioned we all get as children. There's lots of evidence that has to do with this. Part of it is biochemical in terms of the parts of the immune system and the types of immune cells that are activated once we get allergies. And I also talked about hookworms a little bit as an introduction to this topic, and you can see there's a map of hookworm infection prevalence, and like I said, I'm just going through these slides. You can see them if you want to go look at the PowerPoint. And I talked about this individual who had some severe allergies and decided he was going to get himself an infection, and his allergies were actually reduced, which is kind of an interesting, pretty cool story. If you want to hear a bit more about it, you can go check out this TED Talk. I encourage you to check it out. As part of this class. This guy talks a lot about this individual and hookworm infection. He talks about the connection between worm infections and autoimmune diseases, or I guess it would be an inverse connection. If you have worm infections, you don't usually get autoimmune diseases, and definitely worth it to check out this TED Talk. So this is another video basically on the same topic from a little bit of a different perspective. I believe this was put together by a company that's trying to sell something or doing some research, so a little bit of a different perspective. So this really is the leading theory about why we get allergies, that it's some sort of misfiring of our immune system against these parasitic worms. There are, though, however, other theories about allergies. Allergies are very, very fast reactions. Usually immune reactions are a little bit more slow and delayed. We're looking at, 20 minutes or 30 minutes, after you get a bee sting. You don't die within seconds, but some allergic reactions are very quick, which some people have a theory that this has something to do with our body trying to expel chemicals. You can see it's talking about the symptoms there, that are expulsion type reactions. So anyway, there are other theories out there about what's going on with allergic reactions. We're going to focus mostly on the worm theory anyway. There are theories about vitamin D, and you can imagine there's still a lot that we don't really know. We're going to kind of delve into some. So here's some of the things I want to talk about a little bit, and all of these have good science behind them. All of them we don't fully understand. They seem to be all a little bit of a slice of the pie in terms of why we get allergies. So let's talk about these one by one. First is the genetic basis. Definitely. I had mentioned before there's quite a bit of allergies in my family. My grandfather had asthma. My brother had quite a few food allergies. I have a son with a peanut allergy. I have a nephew with a peanut allergy. Another nephew with a pistachio allergy. I mean, it just goes on and on. So you can see these heritability estimates. These are done through studies, and I'll cover some of these studies as we go along here. The one thing I must say, though, is it doesn't necessarily mean a specific allergy. If you have a peanut allergy, it doesn't necessarily mean your child will have a peanut allergy. They may have something else. They may have asthma. They may have eczema. They may have some sort of different allergy entirely. You really do have to be sensitized to something before you actually get the allergy to it. So here's a couple of different studies here I want to talk about. So you can see here's an asthma study that looks at, the parents, if both parents or neither parents have asthma, and what percentage of their children have asthma. So if both parents have asthma, it's about a 60% chance that the children will have asthma. If one parent, it's 20%. If neither parent, it's more like 6%. So definitely there is a strong genetic basis to this. Twin studies are famous. I can't remember whether we talked about twin studies before, but these are very useful studies because in this case here, you actually have two people, if you have identical twins, two people that are genetically identical. So now you can test whether you have a genetic basis behind something. Obviously, the best studies are the ones where twins are separated at birth, And so you have people that are genetically identical, but maybe with different environmental exposures. You can at least, from one perspective, compare identical twins to fraternal twins. And fraternal twins will have the same environment, but only share half of their DNA. So let's take a look at some of these results. So apparently, 65% of identical twins share a peanut allergy, whereas only 7% share a peanut allergy. So this again shows a pretty strong genetic basis behind at least peanut allergies anyway. So this was a conclusion. Peanut allergies were 82% genetic. So as I mentioned before, you have to be sensitized to something before you can actually get an allergy. Notice I have the picture of the carrots. When I was a grad student, one of my neighbors was allergic to carrots, which I thought was a really bizarre allergy. But it turned out that the story was he actually worked at a carrot factory. And you can imagine that working at a carrot factory, you might get little cuts or scratches, and getting pieces of carrot under your skin. That's one way to get sensitized to things, particularly through skin scratches and things like that. And so he was sensitized to carrots. You can see this note here about rice allergies being common in Japan, and of course in Japan rice is a huge part of the diet. We're still trying to understand a lot of this, and there is some evidence to suggest that even some exposure can happen in the womb, or at least early on through the skin. Okay, cause number 3. We definitely have to talk about the hygiene hypothesis. So I encourage you to stop your video now and press play on this video. It's a very good introduction. It's kind of a funny little video too, so I hope you enjoy it. It's only 2 or 3 minutes long. So I'd like to just say that all of these allergy causes are not necessarily unrelated. Like I said, they're all pieces of the pie. The hygiene hypothesis is something, though, that's getting a lot of attention among researchers because there seems to be a lot of good information and a lot of good anecdotal, at least, studies. So you can see the hygiene hypothesis is also called the lost friends theory. So what does that mean? It means that it's really important when we're young to be exposed to dirt and bacteria and all sorts of other things to train our immune system how to react properly. And hygiene hypothesis states that, well, in Canada and modern societies, we're often too clean, and so our immune system doesn't develop properly, and therefore we start getting immune responses, all the usual things, asthma, allergies, eczema, those kind of things. This is why it's called the lost friends theory, because we're not getting exposed to enough of our friends of course being the microbes. So here's a couple of studies I just want to show and talk about. You can see here's a 2015 study that talks about the rates of allergies on people that live on farms. It seems that, farmers, particularly cow farmers in particular, seem to have a lot less allergies with them. And there does seem to be some evidence that there's something in cow manure that, believe it or not, protects us from allergies. In fact, the dirtier the cow farmer, the less likely they are to have allergies and asthma, amazingly. Here's another study here looking in Ghana, and you can see it's looking over 10 years as Ghana has become richer, and I guess the thought is presumably cleaner. And you can see they're looking at doubling in asthma-related symptoms. There are tons of studies looking at this. Like I said, they're kind of anecdotal or circumstantial evidence, but you get enough of this and it does really start to paint a picture. Here's another one here as well, looking at a C-section and childhood asthma. So what does that mean? Well, there's actually quite a few studies looking at this particular aspect. So babies start getting exposed to microorganisms as soon as the water breaks and as soon as they start going through childbirth. You can imagine the water breaks, microorganisms are going to be exposed to their mouth and their eyes. As they go through a normal vaginal delivery, there are bacteria in the vagina, and they're going to get exposed to bacteria when they breastfeed and as people handle them. A C-section is a bit of a different story because they're not going through vaginal birth, and therefore they're not getting exposed to certain microbes. And it seems that if you've had a C-section, you have a bit of an increase of developing asthma. And so there are people nowadays actually doing some studies where they're trying to see whether they can reverse this, meaning that babies who undergo C-sections, they're taking a vaginal swab from the mother and wiping it over the baby's face to see if there's going to be any impact on their life in the long run, such as decreased asthma risk. This is all still kind of like new research, but it's a very, very fascinating stuff, particularly for me since I'm a microbiologist. I think I mentioned before a couple of times that these natural experiments are wonderful for understanding some phenomenon, and one natural experiment was, of course, the Berlin Wall separating East and West Germany during the Cold War, during the Soviet era. And East Germany was, of course, in the Soviet end of things, and they were less affluent, there was more pollution, those kind of things. And the thought was that, well, since the pollution was maybe weakening people's immune systems, that there would be more asthma and allergies. It turned out actually there were more allergies and asthma in West Germany, which was the cleaner part of Germany up until 1990. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989, by the way. I'm sure none of you remember that, as you were probably not born yet, but I do remember it as it was in my lifetime. Another thing was, I think I mentioned before, peanut allergies were not really well known in East Germany because they did not have access to peanut butter in very high amounts, and as soon as they started getting access to peanut butter, the peanut allergies started to increase. So that also goes along with the sensitization hypothesis when it comes to allergies. So here's a graph. This one here is looking at actually Alzheimer's disease, which is believed to have some sort of autoimmune causes to it. And you can see as people have more parasitic stress, more parasites, the distribution of Alzheimer's disease seems to decrease. Or if you look at it the other way around, the cleaner countries have more Alzheimer's disease. Of course, people are living a lot longer in Iceland and Denmark and Austria compared to places like Kenya or Ethiopia. Which also gives you an increased chance of getting Alzheimer's. But like I said, there are all sorts of studies looking at this hygiene hypothesis, and it's starting to paint a very interesting picture. So this was part of the same study looking at urbanization, and of course, urbanization means, in theory, less farms and more cleanliness. So like I said, tons and tons of these circumstantial studies. Look at this hand washing studies. So if you hand wash your dishes versus in the dishwasher, you have reduced risk of asthma, eczema, hay fever, those kind of things. Another study, actually this is the same study, it looks like eating fermented foods, so seem to help with developing or not developing allergies as well. Tons and tons of studies. You can read about these in my PowerPoints, and there's probably lots of information I'm going to miss. I'm just going to try to hit the highlights as we go along. So this is one of the more interesting studies that's happened. This was only, I think, 2 years old now, and it was just absolutely mind-blowing, the amount of detail that went into this study. So this study here, they were looking at the Hutterites and the Amish communities somewhere in the States. And if you know a little bit about the Amish and the Hutterites, they're very similar people groups. Both of them originated from, I believe it was German ancestors or Swiss ancestors, so genetically they're very similar. They have a lot of very similar cultural practices, large families, traditional values, all those kind of things. In many ways they're very, very similar. There's one area where they're hugely different. That is in their farming practices. So the Amish are very, very traditional, meaning they still plow their dirt using animals, and as a consequence, the children are involved in the farming practices in every aspect of life. Hutterites are traditional in most areas of their lives, but for farming, they have industrialized. So they're using tractors and machinery. And so in that case, the children are not actually allowed to drive tractors and operate the machinery until they're 16 years old. So now you have a bit of a difference, right, which is a great natural experiment, right? We have children interacting with animals in a lot more degree in the Amish group, and with the Hutterite group, they're not interacting with animals to such a large degree, at least until they're older. So that has a lot to do with when they're developing their immune system. Again, another video to check out. It's relatively short and kind of goes over the details of the study. I'm going to go over the details as well. You can see from this slide, they were mostly looking at asthma, which is much, much less in the Amish community compared to the 21% of the Hutterite community. Here are some similarities between these populations. Like I said, traditional values, breastfeeding, minimal exposure to things like tobacco and alcohol, and all those kind of things. There's a picture, you can see the horses being used to plow versus the tractors being used to plow. So I guess I touched on all these things already. You slides if you want more detail. So here's some information about the groups. You can see they're looking at young children between the ages of 18 and 14. Relatively small study, so less than 30. But it was a very thorough study, and you can see right here, they're looking at these IgE molecules. So as I mentioned, this is part of the immune system that is activated when we have allergies. If you look at the values here, I'm not sure what KU means. I think it's kilo units. I don't know what A is. But you can see the numbers here are much less than the Hutterites. Hutterites are having higher numbers, which shows that the allergy part of the immune systems are getting activated. Here's some other things that they went on and looked at. So they're looking at dust collected from their homes. Not that their homes were dirty. These people do sweep and clean their homes. Every home has dust. You can just go in and find it and collect it. You can see in the Amish community, they actually had more endotoxins in their dust. What does that mean? It means more bacteria in their dust. So, as I mentioned before, this is important for immune development, having exposure to bacteria. Common allergens, you can see the usual things: cats and dogs, dust mites, cockroaches, and they were in higher numbers in the Amish homes and less numbers in the Hutterite homes, and different profiles of bacteria, so probably no surprise there. So here's some of the graphs that they published in this study. You can see that the Amish group has more neutrophils, and these are immune cells that are being activated, and these are healthy immune cells. So you can see their immune system is maybe a little bit stronger than the Hutterites, which is a little bit lower. The Hutterites, on the other hand, have more eosinophils being activated, and these are the immune cells that are associated with allergies. Monocytes, not a huge difference there. And you can see some descriptions in my slides here about what's going on there. So you can see the overall conclusion was that Hutterites have a bit of a suppressed immune system and extra a sense of allergic response. And so that's kind of the important part. So they actually took this to the next level. They used this dust and then they started experimenting on mice. So the whole idea here is you take the dust and you expose it to mice. You basically blow it in their noses somehow. And then you take a look at what's going on in the mouse blood in terms of their immune responses and those things like that. So you can see the first thing here, mice receiving Hutterite dust had higher counts of eosinophils. So there's that allergic response. Amish dust actually inhibited their eosinophils and gave them less allergic type responses. So amazing. I actually went to a talk a couple of years ago by the guy who led this study, and he had mentioned that dust from cows seemed to be a really key thing here that seemed to prevent allergies, and dust from cockroaches did the opposite. Dust from cockroaches actually seemed to enhance allergic and asthma responses. So, of course, there's still a lot that we don't know about allergies. There's all sorts of data and studies looking at these things. You can see I've listed a whole bunch of things that have come up in my research. So things like race and ethnicity. There's probably some differences there. Again, it's hard to tease out what is race or whatever versus cultural practices and things like that. Genders, I believe, I can't remember if it's men or women, but one or the other has more prevalence of asthma than the other. You can see all the usual environmental triggers such as tobacco smoke or air pollution. Those kind of things can certainly affect how our lungs operate and of course, how we're exposed to allergens. You can see, of course, family size and birth order. There's all sorts of things, whether you own cats or dogs, farm animals. Did you go to daycare? Interesting enough, my oldest son went to daycare when he was quite young, 6 months old, and for about a year or two, and he was exposed to all sorts of things. He was sick like constantly. Now he's super healthy, and he never gets sick, doesn't have allergies or anything like that. So again, early exposure to certain pathogens can actually help our immune system get stronger. Not that I'm encouraging you to go out and get your babies sick all the time. But letting them eat a little bit of dirt or pick their nose once in a while may not be a bad idea. You can see mode of delivery. I mentioned C-section versus cesarean and things like that. There's all sorts of theories about various environmental chemicals and things like that that may or may not exacerbate allergic responses. We don't know. You can see breastfeeding is up there. Breastfeeding actually seems to help decrease the amount of allergies and asthma that we have. Again, presumably has something to do with either molecules coming through the breast milk or various bacteria that are found that the baby is exposed to off of the mother's skin. So I want to finish up and just talk about a couple other things. Something that I have been interested since moving to Fort McMurray was peanut allergies. Believe it or not, when just as I was a couple of days before I was getting on the plane to come here for my interview, I found out my son had a peanut allergy. So since then, I've been reading up about peanut allergies and about all of the other kind of aspects around it, of which there's been a lot learned in the last 10 or 12 years. So you can see here's some numbers. Huge percentage of increase over the years, and you can talk to school teachers and nurses, and they all say definitely it's increased. You can see this is the number, so maybe 1 to 2% of the Canadian population has a peanut allergy. It kind of depends on the study. And you can see your chances of outgrowing it are actually relatively low. It's also one of the most risky or scariest food allergies for kids to have because there are more deaths from peanut allergies than any other allergy. You can see here it's talking about the genetic link. So 8.5% of people with peanut allergies also have a sibling with a peanut allergy. So here's a little bit of data for you. This is about 10 or 12 years old now. You can see this is just looking at the genetic aspects of it. You can take a look at it in the PowerPoints when if you want more. So here is something that has been super fascinating. Really, this has been only about 2 years now that this has been out, where there were actually a couple of these clinical trials. One was done in Canada, 1 or 2 done in the States, most of them in small numbers. And you can see what they're trying to do is desensitize people to peanuts. So what they do is very carefully in a clinic, they start feeding children peanuts, so either peanut butter or peanut powder. And they start off with very small amounts, a fraction of a milligram kind of thing, and they work it up. So you can see in this case here, small trial, 48 children, given placebo or peanut protein. Like I said, very, very small amounts. And eventually they work up to the point where these children are able to tolerate a couple of peanuts a day. And very, very high success rate in this. Some of the people had to drop out because of severe reactions. Most patients did have some reaction of some sort along the way, but very, very high success rate. And now most of these kids, basically every day for breakfast, they're eating a couple of peanut M&Ms, and they're able to tolerate small amounts of peanuts, which actually makes it a lot safer for them. They don't need to, not that they're going out and eating peanut butter now all the time, but they don't need to worry as much about warning labels and granola bars that may contain peanuts and things like that. The interesting thing was just announced that there's a new drug for peanut allergies that is being released in the States, and basically the drug is this peanut powder in a tablet form, you're being directed to take it starting in small amounts. Again, I think it has to be in the presence of a clinician because a number of people do end up with reactions, which can be very dangerous in some cases. So there's still a lot of questions about allergies. These are just some that I've been thinking about for a number of years. Why are they increasing? Are we cleaner now than we were 10 years ago? We don't know. This is why a lot of people seem to think there may be environmental chemicals that are sensitizing us more. things that we're being exposed to now that we were not being exposed to 10 years ago? We don't know. Big question mark there. Should pregnant women eat peanut butter? We don't know the answer to this. 2 years ago, Canada, pediatricians in Canada started recommending that we start feeding peanut butter to babies a lot sooner, between 4 and 6 months. They used to tell you to wait off till they were a year, but the data does seem to indicate that it is important to give them peanuts early on to prevent allergies. And the reason for this is a couple of studies. I think I mentioned this in class. There's one in the UK where they were actually encouraging women to not expose their babies to peanut butter till they were 2, and they were really, really good at advertising this, and the allergies went up in the UK. And at the same time, there's a study going on in Israel where peanut allergies are very rare, and it turns out there's a snack that lots of people feed to their babies. It's some sort of peanut butter chip or something like that, like some sort of potato chip coated with peanut butter or peanut powder or something. And people feed these to their babies all the time, and the amount of peanut allergies were very low. So this has changed the recommendation since I started having children. So what about this genetic aspect? You can see this question about, what should we do if we have a sibling that has a peanut allergy? What should we do if you have another child? We don't know. We don't understand why some allergens seem to be much more serious than others. Why are peanuts or bee stings more severe than, say, allergies to cats? We don't really know. And why is it in the same individual one day they can be exposed to peanuts and they just have a mild reaction, and the same individual is exposed to peanuts a week later and it can be life-threatening? So lots of questions there. I guess I just asked that. Why does a reaction vary within an individual? Even the causes of asthma, like I said, with a lot of these environmental causes, there seems to be a lot of variables that go into this. There are some studies that seem to show that, more pollution is linked with asthma for sure. But then I mentioned that East-West Germany study, which seemed to show that more pollution led to less asthma. So there's all these big question marks. Does eczema contribute to allergies? There seems to be a good indication that yes, it does. There was one study done that was looking at eczema. So eczema is itchy skin, and little cracks and pores open up, and I had mentioned skin exposure sometimes can be crucial to allergies. So the theory goes that maybe a mother is changing her baby's bum with a wet wipe, and the baby has eczema, and the mother has peanut butter on her fingers from breakfast, and exposing a baby who's never eaten peanuts can still get peanut allergies, and maybe this is the exposure route. So there's certainly a couple of recent studies addressing this. We've talked about cows and cockroaches, so maybe we're going to get some cow manure and spread it around our house. I don't know. We're still working out the details here on what it is with cows that seems to help us and what does not help us from cockroaches. And maybe we'll end up with some sort of therapy that's some sort of protein found in cows that will end up in our medications. Chemicals, we talked about those already. We also talked about parasites, so maybe someday we won't need to get hookworms to get rid of our allergies. We'll figure out what molecules in hookworms actually interact with our immune system, and that will be the therapy. And I think there's a lot of people that believe this is the way that we're going, as we are going to be able to isolate these molecules, and it's going to lead to effective therapies. So I think this is the end of the slides here. Hopefully this recording has worked out, and sorry this is not quite as good as face-to-face classes, and I hope you guys will be learning something. Keep in touch. Take care.